Okie dokie. 16 March, weekly marks. We're just plodding through this chapter by chapter. Volume 1, Capital, chapter 13 of the Princeton version of translation of Karl Marx's Capital. I noted yesterday the differences and similarities in translation. I used the table from the text to show that this chapter 13 is actually chapter 15 in certain older English translations, so try not to get confused. The title is pretty much the same, chapter 13, Machinery and Large-Scale Industry. My plan today is to read at least just the first section of the chapter because it is about 100 pages of something. It's I haven't actually counted, but it's a lot of pages and more than we can read in today's little session. What I'll do is I'll read the first section, then go to Ed George's, or maybe do a quick traipse through the editor's footnotes or the editor's notes because they are more original, I guess, than in the sense that they're not translations. They are commentaries on their translation, the two Pauls who translated the text. And then I'll read Ed George's notes, which are about 10 pages long as well, and are a reasonable summary without the historical details. Now, if you want to read the historical details, I think I'll, scroll through it, and of course you can go to the page for the web page for this to look it up. So we're up to chapter 13. We got a lot more chapters to go. As I said, I hope we're going to get to the end of this by the time Andy Higginbottom's treatment of volume 3 comes up, because I'd like to hear how he integrates the 3 volumes of Capital together, noting, of course, as I've mentioned in other little yammerings, the difference between the plan for the six book version and how it got winnowed down to 3, and not until after Marx dies. So it has all of those editorial elements in it from Engels. Okay, how machinery developed. In his Principles of Political Economy, John Stuart Mill writes, "It is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toil of any human being," unquote. That, however, is hardly the goal when machines are used in capitalist production. Like everything else that was created to increase the productive power of labor, machinery is supposed to make commodities less expensive and thereby shorten the part of the workday the worker needs for himself in order to extend the workday's other part. That is, the part the worker gives the capitalist for free. Machinery is a means of producing surplus value. Now, when the mode of production is revolutionized in the manufacturing system, labor power is the starting point. But when it is revolutionized in large-scale industry, its transformation begins with the means of labor. So first we'll examine how a means of labor ceases to be a tool and becomes a machine, or how a machine differs from the tools a craftsman works with. Only broad and general characteristics matter here, for there aren't strict abstract boundaries separating historical epochs any more than there are for geological eras. Hasn't stopped, Anthropocene and Capitalocene, whatever. Mathematicians and engineers make the claim, which English political economists sometimes repeat, that a tool is just a simple machine, and a machine is just a complex tool. They see no essential difference between the two things. They even apply the label machine to such simple mechanical devices as levers, inclined planes, screws, wedges, and so on. Every machine is, in fact, made up of simple devices, however disguised or combined. Yet, from an economic standpoint, this explanation doesn't help us at all, since it lacks a historical component. According to another line of thought, the key difference is that tools get their motive force from human beings, whereas machines are powered by non-human natural forces, that is, animals, water, wind, and so on. From this, it would follow that the plow pulled by an ox, something common to diverse epochs of production, is a machine, but Clausen's circular loom is merely a tool, even though it can weave 96,000 picks per minute when powered only by the hands of a single worker. One and the same loom would be a tool when powered by human hands, but a machine when powered by steam, and since harnessing the power of animals is one of humanity's oldest inventions, the use of machines in production would actually predate handicraft production. When John Wyatt introduced his spinning machine in 1735, launching the 18th century's Industrial Revolution, he didn't mention that a donkey rather than a person would supply the power, yet that role did fall to a donkey. A machine to spin without fingers is how he phrased it. All advanced machinery is made up of three fundamentally different parts: the motive mechanism, the transmitting mechanism, and finally, the tool machine or working part of the machine. The motive mechanism powers the entire machine. In some cases, for example, the steam engine, the calorie machine, and the electromagnetic machine, it produces its own motive force. In all other cases, the motor gets its power from an external, natural force. A water wheel is powered by the natural movement of water, a windmill is powered by the wind, and so on. The transmitting mechanism is an assemblage, oh, that word again, of flywheels, shafts, toothed wheels, pulleys, straps, ropes, bands, and all kinds of gears. It serves to control the machine's movement, changing the form of that movement whenever necessary, for example, from linear to circular. It also distributes that movement, conveying it to the tool machinery. The first two parts of the mechanism exist only to move to the last part, which acts upon an object of labor and purposefully alters it. It was with this part, which acts upon an object of labor, and it was with this part, namely the tool machinery, that the Industrial Revolution began in the 18th century. Its function as a starting point is still being renewed every day, or whenever craft labor and manufacturing workshops are transformed into machine-driven industry. If we take a closer look at a working machine, we will see here that, as a rule, the tools and devices used by craftsmen and manufacturing workers reappear, although often in an extensively modified form. Furthermore, they are now not tools for a human being, but rather tools for a mechanism, mechanical tools. Either the whole machine is just a mechanical version of a traditional artisan's tool that has been altered to a greater or lesser degree, for example, the power loom, or the working organs attached to the frame of the machine are our old friends, such as spindles in a spinning machine, needles in a stocking loom, saw blades in a power saw, or knives in a chopping machine. The difference between these tools and the main body of the working machine extends all the way to how they were born. In general, the tool parts are still produced by artisanal labor or in the manufacturing workshop, and only afterward are they attached to the bodies of working machines that are themselves produced by machines. A tool machine is thus a mechanism that, upon being set in motion, uses tools to carry out the very same operations a worker once performed with similar tools. Whether its motive force comes from a human being or another machine makes no difference here. The moment that a tool is removed from a person's hands and mounted as part of a mechanism, a machine has taken the place of a mere instrument. The change jumps out at us right away, even when human beings are functioning as the machine's first motive mechanism. A person's natural instruments of production, i.e., his own physical organs, limit the number of instruments of labor he can wield at the same time. In Germany, spinners were initially made to work two spinning wheels simultaneously, which meant working with both hands and both feet, but that proved too strenuous. Later, the treadle spinning wheel with two spindles was invented, but virtuoso spinners who could spin two threads at once were about as common as two-headed people. The jenny, spinning jenny, however, spun with 12 to 18 spindles, even in its earliest form. The stocking loom knitted with as many thousands of needles operating at the same time, and so on. From the start, tool machines were freed from the organic constraints that limit the number of tools a worker can handle. With many manual tools, the difference between a person's functions as the mere supplier of the motive force and as the worker who actually uses the instrument is marked by a physical separation. Take, for example, the spinning wheel. The worker's foot acts only as a motive force, pumping the foot pedal while his hand pulls and twists, carrying out the real operation of spinning. It was the latter part of the craftsman's tool that the Industrial Revolution took control of first, leaving the human worker to perform the new labor of using his eyes to oversee the machine and his hands to fix its mistakes, while above all, he still played the purely mechanical role of supplying that motive force. In contrast, where human workers had always done nothing but provide that force, say by turning the crank of a mill, pumping, moving the arm of a bellows up and down, pounding with a mortar, and so on, animals, water, or wind were soon employed to drive a device's movement. Partly within the manufacturing period, partly, if also sporadically long before it, such devices rose to the level of machines. But they didn't revolutionize the mode of production. That they were machines even when they were still craftsman tools became apparent during the period of large-scale industry. For example, the pumps that the Dutch used to empty the Lake of Haarlem in 1836 to 37 were built according to the same principle as ordinary ones, the sole difference being that their pistons were powered by gigantic steam engines instead of human hands. In England, the blacksmith's ordinary and crude bellows has somehow been turned into a blowing machine simply by connecting its arm to a steam engine. The steam engine was invented at the end of the 17th century, or during the manufacturing period, and early forms of it even existed until the 1980s without bringing about an industrial revolution. In fact, the reverse happened. The creation of tool-wielding machinery made it necessary to revolutionize the steam engine. The moment that a human being starts to function merely as a tool machine's motive force instead of acting upon the object of labor with his own tool, it becomes accidental whether human muscle supplies the machine's force or water, wind, or steam does. But this hardly means that such a shift won't lead to major technological changes in a mechanism originally designed to run on human muscle alone. Nowadays, almost all genuinely new machines, such as the sewing machine and the bread-making machine, are made to run on both human and purely mechanical motive forces. The exceptions are machines with particular features that prevent them from being used on a small scale. As the starting point of the Industrial Revolution, the machine took the place of the worker. A person who handled just one tool was replaced by a mechanism wielding many similar tools simultaneously and powered by a single motive force of whatever type. Here we have the machine, but only as a simple element in machine-driven production. A machine that has been enlarged and wields more tools at the same time needs a larger mechanism to supply its movement. In addition, for an enlarged motive mechanism to overcome its own inertia, the force that drives it has to be more powerful than human beings can be. To say nothing of the fact that when it comes to producing continuous uniform movement, human beings leave much to be desired. Once a tool machine has replaced the worker's tool, and a human worker functions only to supply the motive force, natural powers can take his place there also. Of all the great motive forces handed down from the manufacturing era, horsepower is the worst. For one thing, a horse has a mind of its own, and for another, horses are expensive and can be used in factories only to a limited extent. Yet horses were often put to work during the infancy of large-scale industry. Both the Jeremiads of the agronomists of the time and the term for mechanical power still current today, horsepower, testify to this use. Wind, for its part, was too unsteady and hard to control, and moreover, water power predominated in England, the birthplace of large-scale industry, even during the manufacturing period. As early as the 17th century, attempts were made to turn two pairs of millstones with a single water wheel, but the enlarged transmitting mechanism proved to be too much for the water power, one of the factors that led people to analyze friction more precisely. Likewise, the uneven effects of motive forces on mills set in motion by pushing and pulling a lever led to the theory and also the use of the flywheel, an invention that went on to play a very important part in large-scale industry. Thus, it happened that the first scientific and technological elements of large-scale industry were developed during the manufacturing period. Water always served as the motive force for Arkwright's throttle spinning mill, yet relying on water power as the main motive force made for certain difficulties. The flow of water couldn't be increased as needed, and thus insufficient flow, which occurred during certain seasons, was hard to remedy. Above all, it was by nature local. Not until Watt invented the so-called dual-acting steam machine was there a motor that could produce its own motive force by consuming coal and water that would give its users full control over the power output, that was mobile and could serve as a means of locomotion, that could be urban, unlike the rural water wheel, making it possible to concentrate production in towns, whereas the rural water wheel had meant production had to be scattered throughout the countryside, and that was of universal technological applicability. Finally, local circumstances played a relatively small role in determining where Watt's motor resided. Watt's great genius was displayed in the specification written into his patent of April 1784, which presented his steam engine not as an invention meant to achieve particular ends, but as an agent that would generally advance large-scale industry. He pointed to various applications, some of which wouldn't be introduced for another 50 years, for example, the steam hammer. However, Watt also doubted that his engine could be used to power ships and was, of course, wrong. At London's Industry Expo of 1851, the great Crystal Palace exhibition, his successors, Boulton and Watt, exhibited their colossal steam engine for ocean steamers. Once the tools of a human organism were transformed into the tools of mechanical apparatus, i.e., the tool machine, the motive mechanism also acquired its own independent form, a form not held back at all by the limits of human strength. As a result, the individual tool machine we have been examining sank in stature, becoming a mere element in steam-driven production. Now, a single motive mechanism could power many working machines at the same time. The motive machine grew in step with the number of working machines being powered simultaneously, and the transmitting mechanism became an extensive apparatus. Now, we now have to distinguish between cooperation involving many machines of the same kind and a system of machines, which is kind of extrapolating from the prior chapter of cooperation. In the one case, a single machine drives the entire process of production, executing all the different operations that a craftsman once performed with a single tool, say a weaver with a loom, or that multiple craftsmen all once performed one after the other using different tools, either independently or in a manufacturing workshop. Take the production of envelopes in the modern manufacturing system. One worker folded the paper with the folder, another applied the gum, a third turned over the flap on which the emblem was impressed, a fourth embossed the emblem, and so on. Before each specialized operation could be carried out, each individual envelope had to change hands. A single envelope machine now performs all the operations at once, and it can make more than 3,000 envelopes in an hour. On display in the London Industry Expo of 1862 was an American machine that produces paper cornets or cornets. It cuts the paper, pastes it, and folds it, turning out 300 units per minute. A total process that the manufacturing system divided into a series of operations carried out here by a single working machine that combines several tools. Such a machine might just be a complex manual tool reborn as a mechanical mechanism, or it could be a combination of different simple instruments that the manufacturing workshop adapted to particular tasks. Either way, simple cooperation reappears in the factory, i.e., a workshop based on machine-driven production, and if we disregard the actual workers, it reappears above all as a conglomeration of similar working machines in use at the same time and in the same space. Thus, a weaving factory is made up of several or made up of many mechanical looms operating side by side, and a sewing factory is made up of many sewing machines placed next to one another in the same building. However, there is a technological unity because the many identical working machines are driven by the heartbeat of a shared prime mover whose force is imparted to them simultaneously and in equal amounts by a transmitting mechanism that they also share, at least to some extent, since its means of conveying movement branch off to each working machine. This is like those, two-story belts that um, can run between floors of a building. Just as multiple tools constitute the organs of a working machine, so multiple working machines are now simply the identical organs of a single motive mechanism. Now, in this case, a true system of machines hasn't replaced the independent individual machine. For that to happen, an object of labor has to pass through a series of connected graduated processes that are executed by a chain of diverse yet complementary work machines, complementary tool machines. The manufacturing system's signature form of cooperation, cooperation based on the division of labor, reappears, but as a combination of machines that perform specialized tasks. The specific tools of different specialized workers, for example, beaters, combers, shearers, and spinners in the production of wool, now become the tools of specialized machines, each of which operates within a system of combined tool machines and served as the particular organ of a particular function. In the branches of industry where the machine system is introduced first, the manufacturing system generally provides a natural foundation for dividing and thus organizing the production process. Yet an essential difference emerges right away. In the manufacturing system, a worker, whether on his own or with a group, has to carry out a particular specialized process using a manual tool. We can therefore say that the process appropriates the worker. But prior to this, it had to be adapted to him. This human principle in dividing labor has no place in machine driven production. Here, the whole process is oriented around things and considered in and for itself, and it is broken down into its constitutive stages. While the technological problems of how to execute each specialized process and link the different specialized processes together are solved by applying knowledge from mechanics, chemistry, and so on. Although, as elsewhere, theoretical concepts have to be complemented by practical experience accumulated on a large scale. Every specialized machine provides the next machine in the system with its raw material, and since the machines are all in use at the same time, the product is always being worked on at some stage of its production and always going from one stage to another. And just as the direct ratios of the workers needed in different groups, so the specialized machines in an organized system where one machine is constantly being put to work by another establish a definite ratio of the machines needed, as well as what their sizes and speeds have to be. The combined working machine is now an organized system made up of different kinds of working machines, either individual machines or groups of them, and the system becomes all the more perfect the more continuous the total process is. Or the less often the raw material is interrupted as it is passed from the first stage of its production to the last. In other words, the system is perfected the more that machines rather than human hands transport the raw material from one stage of production to another. If the principle of isolating different specialized processes goes with the division of labor in the manufacturing system, a key principle in the fully developed factory is, in contrast, the continuity of specialized processes. Whether a system of machines is based on the cooperation of identical machines, as in weaving, or a combination of different kinds of machines, as in spinning, it becomes a giant automaton the moment it is driven by a self-acting prime mover. Now, of course, where there's a whole system of machines driven by, say, a steam engine, individual tool machines might need a worker's help for certain movements. That is, before the self-acting mule was invented, a worker had to help insert the mule carriage, and he still has to do that in fine spinning mills. Or a worker might have to manipulate some parts of a machine as though they were hand tools in order for the machine to perform its work. This happened in machine making workshops before the slide rest was turned into a self-actor. But once a working machine no longer needs human help to complete all the movements that transform its raw material, once it requires only incidental assistance, we have an automatic system of machines whose individual components can always be improved. The apparatus that immediately shuts off a spinning machine whenever the silver breaks is thus a very modern invention, as is the self-acting stop that shuts off the improved steam loom whenever the shuttle bobbin runs out of weft. The modern paper factory exemplifies both the continuity of production and the way the automatic principle has been implemented. In fact, paper production supplies us with rich material for studying in detail both the differences between modes of production that are based on different means of production and the connection between those modes and the social relations of production. For the old German paper-making trade is a model of artisanal production, while paper production in 17th century Holland and its counterpart in 18th century France are models of the actual manufacturing system, and in modern England, paper-making is a model of automatic production. Moreover, in China and India, two distinct ancient Asian forms of this industry still exist. Machine-driven industry in its most advanced form operates as an organized system of working machines whose motive force is imparted from an automatic center solely by the transmitting mechanism. The individual machine has been replaced by a mechanical monster whose body fills an entire factory building and whose demonic power, obscured at first by the measured, almost solemn movements of its gigantic parts, is now on display in the wild, whirling, feverish dance of its countless working organs. There were mules and steam engines before there were workers whose sole occupation was to produce mules, steam engines, and so on, just as people wore clothes before there were tailors. But the machines invented by figures such as Vaucanson, Arkwright, and Watt could be implemented only because the manufacturing period supplied each inventor with a large quantity of skilled mechanical workers. Some of those workers were independent artisans who had practiced different trades. Others who had been grouped together in the manufacturing workshop, where, as mentioned, the division of labor was particularly strict. As new inventions proliferated and the demand for newly invented machines grew, machine production split off more and more into diverse, independent branches, while at the same time, labor was increasingly divided in the manufacturing workshops that built the machines. So it is here, in the manufacturing workshop, that we find the immediate technological foundation of large-scale industry. The manufacturing system produced the very machines that large-scale industry used to supplant the artisanal and manufacturing systems in the spheres of production it took over first. Machine-driven production thus arose spontaneously on a material foundation that was poorly suited to meet its needs. Now, once it became more advanced, it had to revolutionize that foundation and create one more compatible with its own mode of production. Although its original ready-made foundation did evolve somewhat in its old form during the early part of large-scale industry's rise. Just as the individual machine remained a dwarf as long as it was powered by human beings, and just as systems of machines couldn't evolve freely until natural motive forces, that is, animals, wind, and water, were replaced by the steam engine, just so the development of large-scale industry was held back in every way when its characteristic means of production, the machine itself, owed its existence to personal power and skill, i.e., when the production of machines took place outside large-scale industry and turned on how well-trained human muscles were, how sharp a person's vision was, and how skillful artisans and specialized workers in the manufacturing systems were in handling their dwarfs' instruments. Now, aside from the fact that producing machines by hand is expensive, a consideration that is weighed decisively on capital, all that determined how how much all that determined how much industries already driven by machines could expand, as well as the extent to which machines could take over new branches of industry was how a category of semi-artistic workers could grow. And given the nature of the workers' occupations, that category could be added to only gradually, not by leaps and bounds. But once large-scale industry developed to a certain point, it began to conflict with the technological foundation that it had taken from artisanal labor and the manufacturing workshop. Motive mechanisms, transmitting mechanisms, and working machines were enlarged. Their components became more numerous and complex and more standardized, too, as working machines came to be built more and more according to new models, not the ones in the artisanal system, and acquired an independent form determined only by their mechanical task. The automatic system developed further, while materials that are difficult to work with, such as iron instead of wood, couldn't be avoided in the same way as before. On all sides, attempts to solve these spontaneously arising problems ran up against the human limitations that even the combined worker in the manufacturing workshop could only partly overcome. Such machines as the modern hydraulic press, the modern power loom, and the carding machine could never have been made within the manufacturing system. When the motor production is revolutionized in one sphere of industry, it has to be revolutionized in others as well. This holds above all for branches of industry that interlock as stages of a total process, despite being so isolated by the social division of labor that each produces an independent an independent commodity. Thus, machine spinning necessitated machine weaving, and together they necessitated the mechanical chemical revolution in bleaching, printing, and dyeing. Thus, too, massive change in the cotton industry called forth the invention of the gin, which separates the seeds from the fiber and has enabled cotton producers to operate on the large scale that the present day requires. In addition to this, when the mode of production was revolutionized in industry and agriculture, it became necessary to uh, it became necessary to revolutionize the general conditions of the social process of production. The means of communication and transportation, for instance, were once created for a society where small-scale agriculture and its domestic sub-industries and urban craft trades were the pivot, to borrow Fourier's phrase. Those means couldn't begin to satisfy the production needs of the manufacturing period with its expanded division of labor, concentration of the means of labor, and workers and colonial markets. Similarly, the means of transportation and communication handed down from the manufacturing period quickly became an unacceptable drag on large-scale industry, which operates at a feverish pace and on a massive scale, constantly thrusts quantities of capital and workers from one sphere of production to another and creates many new connections through the world market. The communications and transportation industries were therefore gradually adapted to large-scale industries' motor production through a system of river steamships, railroads, ocean steamships, and telegraphs, to say nothing of how shipbuilding itself was completely revolutionized. However, the frightful quantities of iron that now had to be forged, welded, cut, bored, and molded required for their part gargantuan machines, machines that the manufacturing system simply couldn't make. Large-scale industry had to take over the production of its characteristic means of production, the machine, using machines to build machines. In this way, it created the first technological foundation that was equal to its needs and thus began to stand on its own 2 feet. As machine-driven industry expanded in the first decades of the 19th century, it gradually took over the production of the tool machines themselves. Yet only during the past few decades has the immense scale of construction in the railroad and shipping industries called forth the mechanical behemoths that now produce motive mechanisms. The most essential condition for making machines with machines is a motive mechanism whose output of power is both limitless and easy to control. Such a mechanism already existed, that is, the steam engine. But there was also a need for machines that could produce the precise geometrical shapes, that is, lines, planes, circles, cones, and spheres, that the individual parts of machines require. Henry Maudslay solved this problem in the first decade of the 19th century when he invented the slide rest. It soon became automatic and in a modified form was used to do things beyond its original purpose, namely to make lathes, such as produce a variety of construction machines. This mechanical device didn't replace some particular tool, but rather the human hand, which creates a given form by holding, tracing, and guiding the blade of cutting instruments along or above a material being worked on, for example, iron. The degree of ease, accuracy, and rapidity that no amount of experience could have imparted to the hand of the most expert worksman. Let us turn to the actual tool machine of the machines used to produce machines. The artisan's tool reappears here, only now as a colossus. For example, the tool component in the drilling machine is a gigantic drill that is driven by a steam machine, but that makes it possible in turn to produce the cylinders of large steam engines and hydraulic presses. The machine lathe is the ordinary foot lathe reborn with the strength of a titan. The planing machine is an iron carpenter that works on iron with the same tools a carpenter uses on wood. The tool that cuts veneers on London's wharves is an enormous razor. The tool part of a shearing machine, which cuts iron just as easily as a tailor's scissors cut cloth, is a huge pair of scissors. And while the head of a steam hammer is just an ordinary hammerhead, it is so heavy that Thor himself couldn't swing it. One type of these steam hammers, which were invented by Naismith, weighs more than 6 tons and strikes with a vertical fall of 7 feet on an anvil weighing 36 tons. Pulverizing a granite block is child's play for it, but it is no less capable of driving a nail into soft wood with a series of light blows. When means of labor become machines, they take on a material mode of being that makes it necessary to replace human strength with natural forces and to replace traditional practices with a conscious application of natural science. In the manufacturing system, the organization of the social labor process is purely a matter of organizing people. It amounts to combining specialized workers. In the machine system, as opposed to the manufacturing system, in contrast, large-scale industry has an organism of production that is wholly made up of things, and that the worker encounters as an already finished material condition of production. In simple cooperation, and even where cooperation has been specialized through the division of labor, the associated worker's supplanting of the isolated worker still appears as more or less accidental. But apart from a few of the isolated worker still appears, but apart from a few exceptions to be mentioned later, machinery can function only in the hands of directly associated labor or labor in common. The cooperative character of the labor process is now a technological necessity dictated by the nature of the means of labor. Now, I could yammer quite further on, but that would probably double my time, considering that section 2 is quite lengthy and with subsections. But he continues on to explain, and very systematically, how tools operate and how the organization of the process by capitalists is actually very important. Also, as labor becomes both de-skilled and exploited, although that would be a later way of thinking about it in the process. So it is, he does get around to discriminating between use and exchange value in this particular context. He and talks about the different types of products that have, different skills and processes, and that how machinery or a machine division of or machine organization alters the sets of relations, and notes, of course, workers displaced by machines. So, and he says that that's not, it may seem like progress, but in fact, it isn't, considering how many people become immiserated by the process. So, yes, this goes on and on, but I think what is important is that I think Marx acknowledges, and he's not a pure technological determinist and a modernist in that particular context, but he does identify how important it is to consider that uneven developments occur. That is, while a lot of this happens in a concentrated form in cities, in in other kinds of areas, less populated areas, for example, there's uneven development of these processes. On the other hand, there is the pressure to the pressure of scale, that is to get more people to offer them, as it were, wages that would attract people to cities, to or at least to the periphery of cities where all the machines are, to get them to work. And so you get larger, as David Harvey would describe it, a kind of disintegration of space and time, right? As we've talked about before. So anyway, there's a lot of pages here, and let me swiftly go through the editor's notes so that you get a sense of what they were thinking about when they translated this darn thing. They note that a certain kind of idiomatic expressions don't have good philological sources for them. So they say they just throw up their hands in one note and say, well, we just couldn't find we couldn't find the etymology of some of these terms or idiomatic or localized phrases. Although I assume there's uh, a bunch of things that an army of graduate students will look at someday. So as you can see, we're up to 100 and some odd, over 200, 200 footnotes for this sucker, which are now endnotes, I'm sorry to say. And so it gets a little intense. Let's just put it that way. Yes, he talks about divisions of labor, children's work as opposed to the work of women, etc. Mine, mining operations, the problems of working within mines, and a variety of other health-related issues in terms of industrial pollution et al. So these are the editor's notes for Chapter 13, Machinery and Large-Scale Industry, Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1, the 2024 edition. John Stuart Mill is mentioned occasionally in Marx's political economic writings, as is his father, James Mill. By and large, J.S. Mill shows up as the well-known English political economist, although he is much better known today as a political philosopher invested in a single principle for human action, that every act is supposed to be, ideally, conducive to happiness, a position that is sometimes called utilitarian and perverted, of course, when um, people don't talk about commodities but utils. Anyway, um, needless to say, the text principles of political economy, with some of their applications of social philosophy by Mill, of 1848, becomes a standard economics textbook for many years. Uh, Editor's Note 2. Soon after publishing the first edition of Capital, Volume 1, Marx contributed a resolution to the Brussels Congress that gave two sides to machinery's effect, a bad side and a good one. Resolved, quote, that on the one side, machinery has proved a most powerful instrument of despotism and extortion in the hands of the capitalist class. That on the other side, the development of machinery creates the material conditions necessary for the superseding of the wages system by a truly social system of production. You can imagine that some people's eyes glazed over. But anyway, needless to say, it is about policy for Marx as well. It's not idle theory. Editor's Note 3. Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx were friends, intellectual collaborators, and co-conspirators in international socialist organizing for 4 decades. Although Marx was merciless in his criticism of others, especially others on the left, Engels counted as a lifelong ally, and at times as actual life support. Engels kept Marx afloat financially over long periods, sending him what amounted to a stipend. Soon after they met, Engels and Marx embarked independently of each other on a common project to glean insights from those who benefited least from the social system, and to use those insights, combined with economic and philosophical arguments, to benefit those same people. Now, this, of course, became a joint project The two worked together as journalists, co-wrote texts theoretically and practical, most notoriously the Communist Manifesto, and thought together in concert through a correspondence that continued from shortly after re-meeting in 1844 until just before Marx's death in 1883. A typical letter between them ends with the words, "Think about this," or "Please give me your opinion on the matter." Engels wrote an early article about political economy, Outlines of a Critique of National Economy, 1844, which inspired Marx to launch his own economic work. Marx refers to this text 4 times in Volume 1 of Capital. Some of Marx's journalistic articles were actually written by Engels, and in many cases it is impossible to attribute individual authorship to key Marxian ideas. The friends passed arguments back and forth like raw material in a workshop to be reworked and refined in the fire of the other's critical eye. Yes, there's a text analysis project in there. Anyway, in the book mentioned here, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845 in German, Engels wrote about his experiences on a 20-day stay in Manchester, England, where he observed the effects intensive industrialization had on workers. Unlike Marx, Engels didn't enter critical theory through the university. He never got a degree. His father was a wealthy mill owner in fast industrializing Western Germany, and Engels was being trained to join the business. The trip to Manchester in 1842 was for Engels at age 22 to continue his commercial training and to also leave behind the radical politics and philosophy he had been absorbing. It did complete his training. At the same time, he gave those same radical politics a grounding in current social conditions. He chronicled the astonishingly poor conditions for laborers in the Manchester mills and the deleterious effects of high productivity manufacturing on their health and well-being. The book was written as a report to German intellectuals about the real basis for the coming social revolution. With this book as a starting point, Engels went on to become an influential social theorist, if also at times a controversial one. Stephen Marcus notes in Engels' Manchester and the Working Class, 1974, in some senses, Engels never gave up his conviction that the revolution would take place next Thursday. In addition to his own involvement in labor mobilization, Engels wrote books such as Anti-Düring, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific of 1880, and The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, 1884, whose claims were later taken up by revolutionary movements, in particular the ones spearheaded by Vladimir Lenin in Russia. And yet, he also wrote on less revolutionary topics like philosophy, natural science, and the history of religion. One of his most abiding achievements is philological and editorial. He shepherded many of Marx's works into the public eye. It was Engels who, after Marx's death in 1883, undertook the enormous project of editing the manuscripts for volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, and places little more than scattered notes into readable books. Editor's note 5, since we've stressed that Marx sometimes enlivened the language of the factory inspectors' reports as he translated them, we should also note that his translations go in the opposite direction as well. For example, Marx doesn't try to preserve the literary flourish at the end of this long quotation until the end of the 150 hours was told. Instead, his rendering has 150 hours being merely abgesalt, or counted off. The sunny time of his first love is playing off a line from Schiller's Song of the Bell, The Wonderful Time of Young Love. And as they note in note lowercase 7, scholars haven't been able to locate the source or sources for these memorable and much quoted phrases, which Marx gives in English. This holds for us too, unfortunately. Number 8, this is one of the paraphrase and a direct translation. The figure of labor performed over a long period being compressed into a shorter one, a figure Marx often employs in discussing the intensification of labor, certainly conveys something said in the English source material, but it doesn't have an immediate equivalent here. That is, the source text reads, 12 hours work was, it further appeared, now done instead of 10. And let's see, Big Loaf was a slogan of the Anti-Corn Law League, the idea being that if free trade were introduced, wages would rise and workers would be able to afford twice as much bread. Their loaf of bread would be doubled, becoming a big loaf. And then there's Latin, of course. Nominibus moliere licet mala. It is proper to lighten evils with words from Ovid. And experimenta in corpore vili is a Latin expression meaning experiments on a worthless body. Lowercase 13, editor's note. Marx is quoting from an article from the Times, 1863, titled The Cotton Famine. In 1833, the China and Indian trade was opened, and during the last 30 years, it had extended itself in the East by the destruction of the human race. Lowercase 14, we're almost to the end. The first part of this long quotation is more a paraphrase than a translation. When he gets to the phrase, each molder, Marx changes his strategy. He starts to follow the source material more closely. In cases like this one, it can be hard to know whether he's committed an error or he's simply translating in a freewheeling way. For example, here he renders fruitful source of demoralization as fortbear kelder demoralization, which back translates into English as frightful source of demoralization. Has he simply made a mistake, or that is written frightful when he meant to write fruitful? This is even easier to do in German than in English, since in the former language, those two words are Fruchtbar and Fruchtbar, respectively. Or, or is Marx amplifying a modifier and eliding what appears to be some irony in the source text? Perhaps because he thought the irony wouldn't work as well in German. Some amplification by way of Elysian here, where the source text has been at times no uncommon thing in Nottingham. Marx drops the qualifying at times, which makes the scene being described seem even more dire. Since Marx leaves out qualifying words in some other cases too, the Elysian was likely deliberate. That is, not simply the result of oversight. We're almost at the end here, you can see, and I'll stop. 16. Marx does some reordering of the source material here so that sentences that come from different passages appear to come from the same one. In doing so, he compresses the source material, dropping some seemingly non-essential words and phrases. But once again, Marx might be doing more than that in eliding certain words. For example, he doesn't translate the term almost, which in the source text modifies is unbearable. Thus, the smell that is almost unbearable in the source text is a stink, Gestank, that is simply unbearable, unerträglich. In Marx's translation, is he weaning out a word for the sake of compression, or is this another instance of amplification through omission? Or do both motivations apply? Or has he left out a word unintentionally? Or did he read the almost as almost an instance of ironic understatement that doesn't translate well? Tayable merci et miséricorde is a French phrase that was applied to serfs during the Middle Ages. It means exploitable at pleasure and mercy. Marx again, number 18. Marx again intensifies a reported sensory impression by dropping the word almost. Where the source material speaks of an effect that is almost overpowering, Marx's translation of the passage simply says of the effect, die Wirkung, that it ist unerträglich, or is unbearable. But his translation also compresses the quotation quite a bit here. So here, too, it's hard to say what exactly motivated the Elysian. 19. Mirabeau's impossible. Ne me dites jamais cet imbécile de mot. Impossible. Never speak that ridiculous word to me, from a letter of the physiocrat Honore Gabriel Riquetti, Count of Mirabeau, wrote to one of his secretaries in 1832. And then École d'enseignement professionnel refers to vocational schools, and ne sutor ultra crepidam is a Latin phrase meaning shoemaker, stick to what you know. And this is actually more interesting because it's a reference to Apelles. The Greek painter Apelles is supposed to have responded with words to that effect when a shoemaker criticized his work. Now, the whole point, and this is a how classical tradition becomes rediscovered in the Renaissance and continues on to this day. When somebody asks coyly, "What's that supposed to be a picture of?" Um, it is essentially the competition or the challenge of Apelles. Are you rendering that object as real as possible? Um, and it is a kind of a pedagogical tool in that particular sense from a art educational point of view. But anyway, ne plus ultra is a Latin phrase meaning peak or zenith. All right, I finally got to the end and used up all my time. And let's see if there's any comments. S&M belt straps, calorie machine, motive force, acting kind of like money. Yes, it is that, I think, analogy, certainly that is operative in the system in a material sort of way, because that's kind of the physics analogy sort of operating as well in terms of nature versus and or capital. Okay, so I've done all that. Let me uh, shut the live stream off and return us to our regularly scheduled program. If someone is listening in real time at 5 o'clock, there will be Star Trek.